Please welcome Dale to the microphone.
Okay, thank you, Jack. Well, I didn't come by ferry. A little simpler method, I guess. I arrived at the hospital Christmas Day, 1941, so that's how I ended up being here. But I'll back up a little bit. My parents came here. Being in the tour business, what's one of the things that people want to know when you start talking about the area or my book? How long you been here? Well, so I'm able to say, well, I've been here since 1941, but I didn't really make the decision to get there. The wisdom for that came from my parents. They were from Washington State, and my father came here in the late 30s on a whaling ship. So he was ended up being a commercial fisherman all of his life, but he got his life started at sea on a whaling ship, and he showed up for a job opening in Bellevue, Washington at Whalers Cove in Mindanao Bay and signed on a whaling ship destined for Yucatan. So he worked for a season on one of the sort of classic killer boats with a big harpoon in the bow, and kind of revolting to us now, but in that era it was kind of the tail end of an era that was still an honorable profession. So that's how we got here. So my early memories are of growing up in a little house down, probably right in front of where the totem branch for the First Bank is. There's a guy named Augustus, and had a grocery store, and he had a rental out back, and that's where my parents, my earliest memories of maybe 4 or 5 years ago were at that location. And I have memories of flying down on the beach under, there was a big marine waves there with a couple boats usually hauled out, and I just went around and marveled at the boats. Guy right across the street named John Peters built boats. He actually built 4 boats in a shed right where Timber Marine Supplier, well, Timber Marine now incorporated into Madison, but there was a boatyard there, and he built 5 trawlers. Each one he named the type, Type 1, Type 2, Type 3, and on. So my parents were pretty much appreciative of wilderness, and I think felt kind of claustrophobic living in town. And so my father bought some property out on what would become where I would grow up for probably the next 10 years, and became Dale Street. He bought a parcel of land from a guy named Nygaard that was a carpenter down at Sunny Point, and had invested and owned a big block of land there. And so it was basically a wilderness from Tongass Highway up to First Avenue, or First Street, I guess it was. So he bought this property back in the middle of about 5 parcels, because he and Mom wanted to get out into the wilderness. So he worked. He was a fisherman in the summer, but he was a carpenter, and at that time he was working on the sawmill down at the base of Carolina. Was a sawmill called Bertelson's Mill, a Norwegian guy, and so that neighborhood was vastly different. There was a sawmill. There was where Sampson Barge is today. There's a TV burner and a shingle mill, and then between the two there was a little salmon cannery. I think that was called Whiz Cannery, but I'm not sure. So anyway, Dad was working down there and decided that he wanted to build a house. And as I recall, the sawmill was going bankrupt, and I'm just guessing that he probably, the reason he ended up buying the property was that I think he got wind that they were going bankrupt, and he didn't know how much longer he's going to get wages out of the mill. So he took it out of lumber, and he got together with a couple other people. There was Al Wright at the end, Harry Diamond, and I think one other person, and they decided they'd build the road together. And he got what they called slab trimmings from the sawmill down at the bottom of the hill there. And so they kind of cut some trees down, laid the slab on the ground, and then got some dirt hauled in. And when the job was done, Dad started on a house, but he couldn't work full time because he was gone fishing all summer. So by the time they got out to their wilderness home, two other homes had been built up, one on either side of them. So it was kind of discouraging. But anyway, he built a home, and so I lived there for a few years. And his mother tells the story. The three guys that built the road got together and said, "Well, what are we going to name this street?" And one guy told my dad, he said, "Well, Walt, why don't you name it after your firstborn?" So that's how I got a street named after me. So we lived there for a while, but again, my parents yearned for some wilderness, and so they found a homestead, a plot that had been homesteaded down in between Pond Reef and South Point Higgins, and a cove down there. If you've been in that area, it was a pretty distinctive cove. There's a guy named Cappy Backer, Cappy they called him, I can't remember his name, but he was about my age, and he had dismantled a home and built a shack. And so my father saw the opportunity to get out in the wilderness where they wanted to be, and then have some money to buy a fishing boat. So he decided he'd make the big break and buy a boat. And so they sold the house for a whopping $14,000. I remember that was a big, big chunk of money. And we bought a fishing boat for $2,500 called the OK. And he bought this parcel of land from Cappy, the homestead. He bought the homesteading rights and the structure, of course, on an acre of land, and for, I think, $2,200. So we ended up out there definitely living off the grid. There was no road. We had to hike to go to school and come home. I had to hike up to Tongass Avenue, or Tongass Avenue, which was probably about a quarter of a mile through the wilderness. But to access the place we usually parked at the end of Pond Reef Road, where it comes right down, a dead end at the cove, because we could more easily get to our house than hiking through the forest. In particular, if we had groceries or things to carry, we would strategize going shopping, so when we got home, the tide was out, because we could walk across the tide flats to get to the house. So we had one coal oil lamp, kerosene lamp, a little shack with a little kind of lean-to for a bedroom for my brother and I. And they had a dynamite vegetable garden. I guess you'd probably call us poor. We didn't think of it that way at that time. I thought it was a great place to grow up. I had my skiff out front, and fishing every day almost if I wasn't in school. So anyway, they put in a great garden, which we dearly needed, I guess, for subsistence. Great carrots and potatoes and sweet peas and fish. Of course, a lot of fish put up in mason jars. And my mother spent a lot of time getting clams. We ate a lot of clams. I like the natives in the wintertime when the dried salmon ran out. So she'd go down and with probably illegal, but a hook on a piece of line, and she'd find a geoduck neck and grab it and then follow the neck down. Those necks are about 2 feet long, and you can do a lot of digging before you ever come to the clams. So anyway, we did that. When the tide went out on the big minor sides, we'd go out and get crab, Dungeness crab out in the crabgrass. And after the fall storms, the crabgrass would all seem like it end up on our beach. Our garden kind of abutted the high tide line. And so this grass would just kind of get rolled up in front of the garden, and they'd go out and in the fall, and then they'd take pitchforks and cover the garden with this grass, all brown by then. But so that had the effect of, in the wintertime, that was our refrigerator for the food. We'd just go out and dig through the snow, through the crabgrass, and we'd get down. Those potatoes and carrots were just like you got them any time of the year. So that's what got us through the winters. So I guess as far as professionally what I did, I went out and did what most kids of commercial fishermen do. I went fishing. I crewed with the family on our 36-foot trawler, fishing Duke, Ketchikan, Duke Island for a few years. And I was about 13 or 14. I wanted my own boat. I wanted to do my own fishing, my own thing. So when I was a sophomore, I built a skiff in the wood shop at the high school under the tutelage of Carol Fader, who's a great teacher. Gave me a lot of support. So built a 12-foot boat, did chores around the neighborhood to buy a whopping 12-horse Sea King from Montgomery Ward's catalog and put it together, and I had just a dynamite sweet little boat, a nice V-bottom boat. And that's where I lived in. If I wasn't doing homework chopping wood, which I did a lot of, I was out fishing, halibut fishing. During that era, the halibut fishermen would lay up. I spent when I was 14, I think, I spent the summer working at Paul Hanson's picking up groceries for the halibut boats. And they had a layup period, and they couldn't fish I think they'd fish for a couple of weeks, and then they'd lay up. So they'd go through all their gear, and it was Manila, so it was always deteriorating. So one day I was loading a boat, and I said, "So what's all that halibut gear doing there? What are you going to do with that?" It was skates of gear. And they said, "Oh, when we get out to Guard Island, we just dump it. We just throw it overboard. We can't trust it to put it in a long string of halibut gear." So it was a bonanza. I did a lot of hand lining or halibut fishing by hand with that cast-off gear. So I did that out in front around Vallner. And then in the about 56, 57, I figured out what a few other guys figured out, but it wasn't commonly known, but the fish traps were a hot spot for king salmon. And apparently there was always a back eddy, and the herring would collect around the trap, and so the king salmon would collect. And one day I thought, well, I'm going to go out. I set my gear out at Grant Cove there, and I thought, well, I'm waiting. While I'm waiting for it to soak, I'm going to go out to that trap, and I'm going to see if I can tie up and put a line down bottom. And the trap watchmen were friendly. Not all of them were. The brindle traps would run you off. They didn't want you around. So anyway, I got a king salmon. Herring was just barely out of sight, and I got a king salmon. I thought, wow. So I started going routinely over there and selling to, was a fish buyer in Meason's Cove. And then I discovered I wasn't the only guy doing that. The Hamlin brothers, Dick and Dave Hamlin, they had Cadillac boats. They had like 16-foot sear planks. I see Dave nodding. We grew up in similar circumstances, but we never really knew each other. Our fathers, I guess, trolled in different areas. But those Rennells were just Cadillac boats, and they were loaded with king salmon. Every time I was sailing, they had lots of fish, more than I fished. And I asked one of the guys, of course, when you're 15 or so, you're kind of naive. And so I said, "Wow, where'd you get all those fish?" "Oh, we got them at a Ship Island." "Oh, wow. Well, it's a long way to run. That's almost a Myers check in a 12-foot scale." I said, "I'm going up there. I want to get a lot of those. Get more fish." So I was going north up the beach, and I see them both fishing at Niblack. So anyway, that was the fallacy of sending me on a wild goose chase. They had to go right by where they were fishing, getting all the fish. So anyway, I pulled over. I didn't do very well there, and I don't know, they maybe had the tide figured out, or that I couldn't. So, and it was a long run. So I went back. I did fish that shore once in a while. There were other traps there. The Balkman Pain trap at the Helm Bay was a pretty good trap, and the trap watchmen were friendly there too. So I fished that area a little bit. Had some rough water to deal with. Camino is a tough hunk of water. I don't know, Dave, your dad probably trolled in that area, didn't he?
It's bigger than a 12-foot boat, though.
Yeah. So I got into some bad tide ropes once, and Bo Smith, who became one of our legislators and was a friend of my father's, was trolling by, and I just could not deal with that. I toughed it out in a lot of tough weather with that little skip, but those tide ropes were more than I could handle. I came up, "Can you tow me through this stuff?" And he said, "Oh, yeah. There's 3 boats to my memory, like same boats and a tender and some other boat that rolled over at Camino. It's a tough lake." So I stopped going up that shore. I had no. Back to Grand Creek, which was a great place to fish. The trick, of course, was to get away from the trap, and they always were on a shoreline where there was a prominent flow or a good flow of fish, and of course there's usually a lot of tide, so you just hang on the down current side with a trip line, and so as soon as you got got a halibut on. I mean, well, sometimes a halibut too if you got down to the bottom, but a king on. You just tripped it to get away from the trap because it had 4 massive long cables into those trap anchors to hold the trap in place. And there's always probably about a 50-50 chance the king was going to go one way and get into the cable, and that was the end of that. You'd have to re-rig up, and so that was the challenge of fishing. But the guys knew my dad, and the Brindles they said they were the most successful company around because they were the best trap robbers, and which I think is probably true. But they were hard people to be around. I thought I'd go down to the Brindle trap, and I knew I couldn't tie up, but I thought, well, I could just idle in the current, just, the grass is greener mentality. I had to go down and try that other trap, and it was a hassle kind of idling in the current and trying to fish. And Joe Brindle showed up with a sterling to braille the trap. He said, "You can't get out of here. You can't be here. Get away." He's shaking his fist at me, this guy with this 80-foot tender and big brownie guy, and I'm a 14-year-old kid and a 12-foot skip. I said, "I don't believe you. Show me the law." So I kept fishing. And I ended up going to Bristol Bay in the 70s, and I fished for his brother out of Naknek, although my station was actually Igagate. But when Brindle was as fearsome as we remember him, or the tales tell, but anyway, he was a hard guy to get along with too. So anyway, but I guess in my book I made a claim, maybe audaciously, that I'm the last fish pirate because in 1958 the law had been passed through Congress that Alaska could become a state. It wasn't until '59 that it actually happened, but. Anyway, so that was the last year of the traps, and so when they brailed the trap at 6 o'clock was a cutoff time, and so when they brailed the trap, one of the watchmen kind of winked at me and he said, "We left you a few." So it's like nirvana, The tender, as soon as the tender got out of sight, boy, I jumped up there. And how do you get them out of a trap? Well, they kind of, I think they dried it up. As the seniors used to call it. They pulled some web up to kind of get the fish up closer to the surface. But the Fish and Wildlife Service had a Grumman goose or Grumman widgeon, and they would fly all the traps at the end of every day to make sure that everybody had their traps closed. They missed the little gap that brought them to the spiller they tied it shut in some ways. So anyway, I was tempted to kind of dry it up and use some web to bring them up and really load my skiff up, but I didn't have the guts because I thought maybe the goose would come over and land and say, "What are you doing with that trap there?" But anyway, so I got put on my snag hook and I started just snagging away, and I had about a dozen fish, and I think I got a big dog going the other way and snapped my bamboo fishing pole. So that was the end of so I had about a dozen fish, and so they were nice bright mix. And so I ran into town to Ketchikan coal storage, and I went up in the office. My dad had delivered for years there, and said, "Hey, I got some pinks and chums," because I think the coal storage bought mostly king salmon. New England bought the trap fish. But anyway, so he said, "I'm not buying any fish out of a creek." And I thought, well, do I tell him, "No, I got him out of a trap"? No, I didn't get him out of a creek. And I just said, "Okay." So I went out to the Nuisance Cove and sold them to my usual buyer there at the station. So anyway, I'll end on the best story I can think of.